Hello, welcome to the inaugural World War II Emerging Scholars Symposium. I'm Joy Murphy, Education Specialist for the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. We are pleased to have the Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Truman Libraries work together in creating this platform for new scholars. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Amanda Hess. She is going to speak with us about flight nursing in World War II.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, Joy. As she mentioned, my name is Amanda Hess, and I'm going to talk to you today about flight nursing and aeromedical evacuation in World War II. But first, I would like to say thank you to the Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Truman Presidential Libraries for putting on this symposium for emerging scholars. I'm not currently a student, so I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to present some independent research that has recently captured my attention. And I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I want to start out by telling you a little story. In September of 1944, after intense fighting against the Japanese in Palau, 24 wounded soldiers were loaded onto a C-47 to be evacuated to Guadalcanal for medical treatment. The war-weary soldiers were turned over to First Lieutenant Mary L. Hawkins, a flight nurse in the 828th Medical Air Evacuation Squadron, or MAES. Lieutenant Hawkins would be in complete charge of her patients until their disembarkation. Running low on fuel, the C-47 had to make an emergency landing on the small island of Bellona in the Solomon Islands, southwest of Guadalcanal. And here's where the story gets intense. During the crash landing, a propeller tore through the fuselage of the plane, causing a piece of a wooden litter pole to slash the trachea of one of the men. Jumping into action, Lieutenant Hawkins directed the evacuation of the disabled aircraft and rushed to treat the badly wounded soldier. Hawkins administered morphine before fashioning suction and breathing devices using simple medical supplies from her nursing kit and the tubes from a Mae West life preserver. Using these makeshift devices, Hawkins, assisted by an enlisted medical technician, was able to keep the soldiers' air passage clear of blood for 19 hours while they awaited rescue. Because of her leadership, ingenuity, and quick thinking, all 24 of Lieutenant Hawkins' patients survived the ordeal, and Lieutenant Hawkins was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. This remarkable professional was part of a new mission being undertaken by the newly created U.S. Army Air Forces. The mass evacuation of battlefield casualties using transport aircraft manned by specially trained flight nurses had begun less than 2 years earlier, but in that short amount of time had become one of the most successful advancements in military medicine. Between 1942 and the end of the war, over 1,000 flight nurses, nearly that many enlisted medical technicians, were trained at the new School of Air Evacuation at Bowman Field, Kentucky. 18 medical air evacuation squadrons were formed with the mission of evacuating wounded personnel from combat zones across the globe to hospitals in the rear or back to the continental United States. Each flight was staffed by a flight nurse and an enlisted medical technician team to provide care while en route. The flight nurses would work in unheated, unpressurized, and extremely loud aircraft that, because they were used to fly in materiel before being converted to receive the wounded, were unable to fly under the markings and protection afforded to medical transport vessels by the Geneva Convention. Because of this lack of protection, all flight nurses were volunteers. At the end of the war, almost 500,000 casualties had been transported for definitive care away from combat zones. The low fatality rate among evacuees, about 2 per every 100,000 wounded soldiers, reflected the nurses' unique training in aviation medicine and their capacity for independent thinking and quick action. The mission of aeromedical evacuation and the creation of the flight nurse specialty, which proved so successful in World War II, and which we in 2021 have come to acknowledge as a strategic part of any war effort, did not enjoy an easy road into existence. There were institutional and technical roadblocks that threatened to end this innovation before it had ever had a chance to even mature. Flight nursing and aeromedical evacuation needed an advocate and an organizer to overcome these obstacles. And they found that person in Brigadier General David Norville Walker Grant. So now that I've given away the ending of the story, let's talk about how we got there with a bit of background about aeromedical evacuation and the civilian roots of flight nursing. I think it would be safe to say that every type of conveyance created by man has at some point been pressed into service for military use. And the idea of utilizing the skies was an intriguing prospect. There's actually a bit of a myth that the first air evacuation took place during the 1871 Franco-Prussian War, when wounded Parisians were airlifted out of the besieged city by balloons. But despite the excitement and romance of this story, it's probably not true. We do know, however, that the idea of using airplanes to move injured or ill persons was promulgated shortly after the Wright brothers made their historic first flight in 1903. This idea was developed internationally around World War I and throughout the 1920s and 30s. Prior to US engagement in World War I, there were discussions being held about utilizing aircraft to rescue downed pilots, both in wartime and for the many training accidents that were taking place. In 1912, an Army surgeon spoke to the Committee on the Transportation of Wounded in War, which was part of the Association of Military Surgeons. The reaction was not favorable, particularly by the public, and an editorial in the Baltimore Sun, Baltimore being where that presentation was given, I think speaks to the cultural feeling about aviation at the time. The editorial said, quote, "The hazard of being severely wounded was sufficient, without the additional hazard of transportation by airplane." This quote makes me smile a little bit with the luxury of hindsight, because I know now how much of an integral part of our war efforts and our civilian community medevac has become. But at the time, I can see their point. Early airplanes were not the safest, and crashes were a common occurrence. But I think the quote is interesting because it really sums up a sentiment that you can see throughout the early days of the Air Corps and the Army Air Forces by the public, and sometimes by other Army officers. You can see that there's this like skepticism, sometimes fear, and a lack of imagination about the potential that air assets possess. And air-minded individuals would have to contend with that sentiment as they pushed for progress in all areas of the application of air power. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, proved the value of aeromedical evacuation by evacuating wounded Condor Legion troops back to Germany for definitive care in their newly created air ambulances. The Luftwaffe successes in air evacuation in the Spanish Civil War and also in the Russo-Finnish War would be well documented and would provide this body of knowledge to the international community that supported the idea that severely injured patients could still fly, that they could handle the altitude and the pressure, and that their survival rate would increase by taking them to well-equipped hospitals back home. While the United States medical and aviation communities were taking note of this development, there was some interest in medical air evacuation in the US military, shown even by the Surgeon General at the time. Some efforts were being made to procure aircraft with patient carrying capability, but this interest could not overcome the constricted budget brought on by the Great Depression. And no plans were made for the mass evacuation of casualties until the eve of World War II. I'm talking November, right before Pearl Harbor. Now, while there was some interest by the military in transporting casualties by air, there had yet to be any mention of using nurses on military aircraft. On the civilian side, however, during this same time period, nurses were already taking to the skies in commercial airlines. Boeing Air Transport, predecessor to United Airlines, started in 1930 requiring stewardesses on commercial flights to be registered nurses. Other airlines quickly followed suit. Tasked with the safety and comfort of the passengers, the presence of nurses on the flight calmed apprehensive travelers and helped boost the image and reputation of the commercial airline industry. This requirement was, however, later dropped during the war when greater numbers of nurses were needed in the military. That same year, 1930, a female pilot by the name of Loretta M. Schindler had an idea. While flying over the wreckage of a town laid to waste by a tornado, she thought, what if nurses could be flown to the scene after a disaster to render immediate aid? What to alleviate suffering and to save lives? So she took that thought and founded the Aerial Nurse Corps of America, or ANCOA. ANCOA was a civilian organization with a military-like hierarchy comprised of highly trained nurses that, according to Ms. Schimler, was the only organization of nurses that possessed essential aeronautical education. While this claim wasn't exactly true, ANCOA was one of the very few organizations that taught aviation medicine to nurses at the time. Over time, Ms. Schimler made it clear that one of the purposes of ANCOA was to provide these technically trained and physically qualified nurses to fulfill the requirements of the Army and Navy Nurse Corps in war and national emergencies. In her vision, they would provide their nursing skills in air transports at airports and air bases for the military services. At the time, however, the American Red Cross was the only volunteer organization authorized to render aid to the medical department of the Army. So Ms. Schimler took her idea and her organization to the Red Cross to offer their services and was persistent in her requests when she did not get the immediate acceptance that she sought. By all accounts, Ms. Schimler was a forceful personality, and the Red Cross's responses to letters inquiring about flight nurses revealed an official opposition to the idea and increasing annoyance at Ms. Schimler herself. But the Red Cross did take the idea to the Army and the Navy. As late as 1940, the director of nursing of the American Red Cross stated that the military had on more than one occasion in the preceding 2 years held conferences between the representatives of the Army and the Navy Nursing Corps and the Red Cross regarding military application of aerial nursing, each concluding with the reassurance that neither the Army nor the Navy wishes to request any special action in regard to the services of nurses in the air. It was thought any medical needs of the Army Air Corps could be met by male enlisted technicians trained in first aid. In fact, according to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Meiling of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, who would later serve in the office of the air surgeon, while progressive medical officers were recommending the use of air evacuation, many military authorities still thought it was dangerous, impractical, medically unsound, and militarily impossible, even after the US entered World War II. The idea of sending female nurses into the dangerous and impractical situation was not a popular one. Receiving no acceptance and borderline hostility by the American Red Cross, Ms. Schimler began reaching out directly to Army personnel that she thought would be interested in her organization. But she was rather disappointed by Major General Henry H. Arnold, Hap Arnold, who was then the acting chief of the Army Air Corps, when he rather dispassionately just directed her right back to the Red Cross. Frustrated but undaunted by the lack of interest, Ms. Schimler continued to press for the inclusion of ANCOA nurses in the national defense structure, eventually attracting the notice of a man who would soon be in a position to bring them to life, then Major David Norval Walker Grant. Dr. Grant was a well-established medical professional in the U.S. Army with experience in the sanitation train, which was the evacuation chain, sanitation being what they called it in Europe during the occupation forces after World War I. And he was also a flight surgeon. While serving as a flight surgeon at Randolph Field, his professionalism and competence garnered the attention and esteem of the Surgeon General's office. And in 1936, he was ordered to attend the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, becoming the first flight surgeon to attend that school. The Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s was a flurry of activity, developing the concepts of the military application of air power, and was home to a group of individuals that would become the Army Air Force's leaders during World War II, and who were big proponents of an independent Air Force. As a flight surgeon, Grant was already keenly aware of the unique requirements of aviation medicine and was developing a strong affinity to the Air Corps. His exposure to the proponents of an independent Air Force at the tactical school likely influenced his later belief in an independent Air Force medical service. I think it's obvious by the title of his thesis, titled The Value of the Autogyro in Military Medicine, that by the time he graduated from the Air Corps Tactical School, Grant was already envisioning the mass evacuation of battlefield casualties by air, although at the time he was uncertain that such a mission would ever be realized. Fortuitously, though, Grant was moving towards a role in which he would be able to combine his personal experience with aviation medicine, his interest in aeromedical evacuation, and this growing body of knowledge regarding the Luftwaffe's successes in air evacuation. He would act as a champion for the Army medical community to develop a plan for the aerial evacuation of wounded servicemen. In August of 1939, now Lieutenant Colonel Grant, who had earned a reputation for being a forceful and a skilled administrator, was sent to Washington, D.C. to assume the post of Assistant to the Chief of the Medical Division in the office of the Air Corps. Due to the illness of his boss, however, Grant would actually end up serving as the acting chief immediately upon his arrival. He found himself walking into a situation where tensions over the growing autonomy of the Air Corps had been brewing for months, with the Army Surgeon General endeavoring to reassume command of the Air Corps Medical Division, which had been operating semi-independently for some time. To give you kind of an idea of his position, in 1939, the Surgeon General was nominally in direct command of most of the Army's medical establishment and was head of an element of the War Department Special Staff, which gave him direct access to the Chief of Staff of the Army. Although the reality of the situation at the time was that the Army's medical department was disjointed and extremely dysfunctional. For example, anything that the Surgeon General wanted to put into effect had to be approved by one or more of the 5 divisions of the General Staff. Frustrated by the dysfunction and by the Army Air Corps semi-autonomous medical department, which was operating under General Arnold, the Surgeon General was attempting to bring the entire medical department back together under his control. All the while, the lead up to the war and then the war itself was increasing the size of the Army exponentially, putting strain on the resources of the Army Medical Department while also increasing the workload and the stress of the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Marshall. This increase led to a bureaucratic nightmare of management problems, issues, and administrative headaches. By mid-1941, approximately 60 different agencies were reporting directly to General Marshall, including the Surgeon Generals, a tenuous situation that would lead directly to the reorganization of the War Department in 1942. In the spring of 1941, Grant was pressing for the creation of an organized aeromedical evacuation system, and he was striving to strengthen the autonomy of the Air Corps Medical Division. The Surgeon General, however, believed that his office was responsible for all aspects of the evacuation chain, air evac included, or a potential of air evac included. With the authority question still unsettled, Grant would have to submit his proposed evacuation plan to the Surgeon General, now Major General James McGee. This plan was actually just set aside with no action taken for almost 9 months. Now, during this time, a couple of things would happen that moved Grant into a position to put his plans into action. First, the Army Air Forces was established in 1941, placed on the same level as the Army Services of Supply and the Army Ground Forces. The Surgeon General of the Army was at that time under the Army Services of Supply, so this change actually added to the distance between his office and the Army Air Forces Medical Division. Second, Grant was promoted and given the new title of the Air Surgeon. So now the argument was Were the Surgeon General and the Air Surgeon co-equal, or was the Surgeon General still the authority? With that authority issue still unclear, and frustrated by the delay in response to his medical air evacuation plan, Grant, armed with his new title, went around the Surgeon General and took a copy of his plan directly to the War Department. The Surgeon General was incensed that Grant had bypassed proper channels, still believing that the responsibility for the evacuation chain belonged to his office alone, and demanded that General Arnold reprimand him. Arnold responded by confirming in no uncertain terms that going forward, the air surgeon would report directly to him and not to the Surgeon General. In November of 1941, plans for aerial evacuation were finally approved, although still without the inclusion of female nurses. The question of jurisdiction was finally settled officially in the summer of 1942 when the War Department was reorganized and the responsibility of air evacuation was given explicitly to the Army Air Forces. Now, the stage was finally set for Grant to put in place a comprehensive plan for evacuation, a plan that, due to his inclusive leadership and personal involvement, would include an expansive opportunity for women as flight nurses. This role reflected the recognition that nurses were the most highly trained medical professionals next to doctors, and that due to the unique physiological issues that could affect an ill or injured body while in flight, America's wounded deserved their specialized care. So at this point, the war in the Pacific had been going on for a few months. And given the tyranny of distance in the Pacific theater, intra-theater evacuation by air had already begun, really out of necessity. With this capability already established, the most critical step now was to institute an effective training program and to formalize the system of evacuation. The School of Air Evacuation was opened at Bowman Field in October of 1942. It would later be moved to Randolph Field at the School of Aviation Medicine. And it was a hard school to get into. Applicants had to already hold a nursing degree, and after applying for a commission in the Army Nurse Corps, they had to serve 6 months in a unit hospital before they could apply to the school. There were also strict height, weight, and age requirements as well. In addition to military training, the flight nurses' education included courses in aeromedical nursing, patient classification, physiology, tactics of air evacuation, logistics, Arctic and tropical medicine, field sanitation, and hygiene. These nurses would also learn how to pack a parachute, how to evacuate a plane if needed, how to swim in her uniform, and would participate in a bivouac before the end of her training. These practical military training skills came in very handy for many of the nurses later in the war, one of whom had to evacuate her aircraft by parachute over China and ended up becoming part of the infamous China Walkers Club as she had to walk back to an Allied area. So flight nurses and medical technicians would also spend time in a low pressure chamber to learn the effects of hypoxia, which is oxygen deficiency, which is a real risk to nursing at high altitudes. This was also a way of weeding out nurses who were not able to take the altitude, and sometimes they would end up washing out of the program. As the first class of flight nurses was entering the school, a plan was actually underway to prove to those in Washington that still had doubts that inter-theater evacuation was feasible and that flight nursing was a key element. A plan that was kept secret from the Surgeon General's office was underway. And this is one of the most interesting stories that I have found about the start of flight nursing. Given the huge responsibility to prove the feasibility of inter-theater evacuation, or the evacuation of patients from combat zones to the continental United States, The first flight nurse, Second Lieutenant Elsie S. Ott, wasn't even a flight nurse and had never even been on a plane. She had actually traveled to her station hospital in Karachi, India, by boat and by train. In January of 1943, she was shocked to find out that she was to transport 5 injured and ill men from her station hospital to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., aboard a C-47 flown by Air Transport Command, and that she had less than 24 hours to prepare. With no flight surgeon to brief her, she was completely on her own to get the job done. She grabbed what medical supplies and medications she thought would be needed, some cots, mattresses, and blankets, and prepared to take her first ever flight. The following morning, Lieutenant Ott boarded the C-47 with her patients, 2 litter cases and 3 ambulatory patients with a variety of medical conditions, followed by a staff sergeant who was assigned to assist her during this trip. Lieutenant Ott provided almost around-the-clock care to her patients and even had to pay out of her own pocket for her patients' lodging and meals on layovers. When I say this trip was kept secret, it was kept secret, even from the stations, hospitals, and the landing areas where Elsie was flying into. The trip lasted 7 days, spanned 11,000 miles, and stopped in 11 locations before reaching Washington, D.C. And although she was so fatigued at the end of her trip that she had to surreptitiously check her dog tag to find out what her name was to fill out her debriefing paperwork, all of her patients went on to make full recoveries. A wing surgeon who met Lieutenant Ott during her trip remarked that to a future flight nurse class that Lieutenant Ott had been mother, nurse, chef, finance officer, housemaid, and latrine orderly, a description that sums up much of the flight nurse experience. The mission proved to be an unmitigated success. It demonstrated that aeromedical evacuation could save lives and it could lessen the burden of hospitals in forward areas. It also generated publicity that inspired scores of nurses to apply to be flight nurses. For this mission, Second Lieutenant Ott became the first woman to be awarded the Air Medal. She later attended the School of Air Evacuation and became an official flight nurse. Less than a month later, the School of Air Evacuation had its first official graduation. While at the School of Air Evacuation, flight nurses were organized into their squadrons and were trained alongside their enlisted medical technicians who would generally stay with them throughout their service in the war. This was done to create a spirit of camaraderie, trust, and familiarity. There was some changing of squadrons to help fill out the roster of other squadrons who were either ready to deploy or who were needed in a different area, or if somebody got sick and had to go home. But an effort was made for those who trained together to serve together. After graduation, flight nurses served in every corner of the globe, working in tandem with pilots and air crews in every aspect of the mission, from configuring aircraft to in-flight management of the patients. Flight surgeons and Air Corps officers placed increasing trust in the flight nurses throughout the war and often relied on them to fulfill the flight surgeons' duties on the ground when needed. The U.S. Army's chain of evacuation in World War II was comprised of 5 echelons, which would start with a medic or a fellow soldier taking a wounded serviceman to an aid station and ended with a transoceanic voyage back to the zone of the interior. Air evacuation typically got involved after the 3rd echelon, after the patient had been seen at a field or evacuation hospital. After injury, the wounded servicemen would be taken through the first 2 echelons by unit or battalion medical personnel, by manual transport, ambulances or other vehicles, arriving at a field or medical hospital where they would stay if their wounds would heal quickly and they could be returned to duty, or to an evacuation hospital if they needed reparative surgery or if they needed to be transported further to the rear for treatment. If air evacuation was determined by the surgeon to be the proper mode of transportation, The injured or ill servicemen would then be taken to the airfield or improvised landing area for pickup by an air evacuation team. Because the Army had opted not to create dedicated air ambulances, the air evacuation missions were actually flown by Air Transport Command or Troop Carrier Commands. The flight nurses and medical technician team would fly out on a C-47, a C-46, or a C-54, and would usually have to unload their cargo before reconfiguring the plane to hold litters, ambulatory patients, or a mix of both. The goal was to be able to unload and reload in 10 minutes, but one squadron of flight nurses actually boasted that they could do it in 6. The flight nurses' responsibilities started on the flight line with the screening and loading of patients. The nurse would take care to position patients where they could receive the care that they needed. Patients with chest wounds, for example, would be placed lower to the ground so that she could access them more frequently. Patients with amputations would be placed with their injury towards the side of the aircraft so that no part of the limb was dangling off their litter where it could be bumped. And patients with broken bones would be placed in areas of the plane where vibrations were lower for their own comfort. While in flight, the nurse would be on constant alert for signs of hypoxia. She issued and adjusted medication dosages according to the altitude and pressure, and would occasionally administer oxygen or plasma. Abdominal wounds were a source of concern because gases in the body would expand in flight, and some flight nurses reported having to cut sutures to prevent further injury. Some injuries necessitated flying at lower altitudes, and in such cases, the flight nurse would work with the pilot to make adjustments. A flight nurse on a medical evacuation flight, like the stewardesses of the 1930s, was a calming presence that alleviated the stress of a wounded serviceman who may have had anxiety over flying, in addition to their injury. Many of the servicemen had never been on a plane before, and taking a flight under these conditions was a very stressful situation. Watching a nurse go about her duties in a relaxed manner was like a tonic to many of them. Sometimes, if no medical care was needed, a flight nurse took on the role of mother, sister, girlfriend, or wife and would just listen or hold a hand. The compassion given was sometimes more important than the medical care. And like stewardesses, they also provided for the feeding and entertainment of their patients, sometimes bringing games or magazines for the patients to read. And one flight nurse told a story about how she actually arranged for the radio operator to lend a serviceman his headphones so he could listen to a broadcast of a baseball game while in flight back home. Since the symposium is organized around the anniversary of D-Day, I would like to take a minute to discuss the flight nurses' role in the invasion of Normandy. In the lead up to Operation Overlord, between January and April 1944, 10 medical air evacuation squadrons were sent to the United Kingdom to prepare for the invasion. That is 200 flight nurses poised and ready to go. To prepare hospitals in England for the expected casualties of the invasion, some squadrons were occupied with the transatlantic movement of patients. However, for other squadrons, the months prior to the invasion were some of the most tedious and least productive of the flight nurses' careers. Many felt useless as they waited for the invasion to begin. To pass the time, one group of nurses said that they would travel the English countryside on their government-issued bicycles because they were not allowed to volunteer in Army Ground Forces hospitals. So they would find other things to occupy their time, sightseeing and traveling. One nurse with too much time on her hands, probably not imagining the trouble she would get into, actually cut off her summer weight uniform pants into shorts for the warmer weather so she'd be more comfortable during her sightseeing. Some nurses, however, were lucky enough to be able to volunteer for 2 weeks at bomber bases throughout England, where they would wait on the flight line to treat returning bomber crews who were often injured by shrapnel and anti-aircraft fire on their missions. Nurses were grateful for the opportunity to utilize their skills and were equally happy to pass out shots of whiskey to uninjured crews upon their return. When the invasion did begin, the flight nurses and their medical technicians watched the planes depart for France before readying medical tents and awaiting their return. It would not be until June 10th that the 816th made the first trip over the channel to pick up casualties from Omaha Beach. One flight nurse recounted that she even slept in a foxhole on Omaha Beach on one of her trips. On the 11th, Grace Dunham made her first flight also to Omaha Beach to pick up evacuees. And she later recalled feeling that there are times in life when one gets the chance to prove themselves, and that this was her moment. One flight nurse, Louise Anthony, made her first trip into France on June 15th and was unfortunate enough to pick up a patient that she knew wouldn't make it through the trip. It was too late to take him off the flight, so she made him comfortable, and not wanting to alarm or upset the rest of the passengers, continued to check up on him, adjust his pillows, check his pulse, even after she knew he had passed. The story speaks to the sentiment shared by many flight nurses who recounted that they had to remain calm for their patients, no matter the circumstance, whether it be death or turbulent air, setting their own emotions aside. The next few months were the busiest time for flight nurses stationed in Europe, with tens of thousands of patients being evacuated as the Army pushed east. In 1944 alone, the 813th had flown more than 25,000 patients, 8,470 of those in a single month. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time to share all of the stories about the individual flight nurses that I would like to. There are so many stories of heroism, like the vignette I shared about Lieutenant Hawkins at the beginning of this presentation. Like Adela Lutz, who flew 196 evacuation missions before she was killed, or Reba Whittle, whose plane was shot down over enemy territory and was held as a POW by the Germans for 4 months, or the 13 flight nurses who crashed in Albania and evaded being captured as they walked over mountains to be rescued on the Italian coast. But I hope that you will look them up because they are great stories and they have great moments of American military history. In spite of their successes, aeromedical evacuation and flight nursing were hampered by institutional as well as some gender bias by traditional officers, and their full potential remained unrealized at the end of the war. A fundamental lack of understanding and an aversion to putting women into harm's way kept flight nurses in the Pacific and China, Burma, India theaters, particularly from flying into combat zones and even on certain routes of evacuation. Additionally, a lack of education in the value of air evacuation to theater commanders and a lack of acceptance of air assets as more than supplemental parts of the Army mission occasionally led to a reluctance to use the air over more traditional means of evacuation. These issues, coupled with coordination and communication issues and a low priority rating given to patients by some theater commanders, created damaging delays, additional exposure and injury to the wounded, and wasted flying hours for the maze. For example, one flight nurse stationed in the Pacific in August of 1944 made over 100 flights, yet only received patients on roughly 30% of them. The reluctance to accept this capability not only reduced the effectiveness of evacuation and wasted the specialized skill of the flight nurse, it undoubtedly cost American servicemen additional pain and suffering and potentially their lives. The nature of global conflict necessitated the creation of the flight nurse specialty. In a sense, development of this capability was inevitable, although it was slowed by bureaucratic wrangling. However dreary and frustrating the bureaucratic battles in Washington were, they were essential in enabling Grant to move ahead with his plans to create an effective air evacuation capability early in the war, including a pivotal role for female nurses. Flight nursing was further developed in the Korean and Vietnam Wars and has become a highly specialized subfield of the nursing profession in the military and civilian spheres alike. I would like to end this presentation with a piece of the Flight Nurses Creed, which was written by General Grant himself, a section that I think sums up the passion and dedication shown by the flight nurses of World War II. Together, with the help of flight surgeons and surgical technicians, I can set the very skies ablaze with life and promise for the sick, injured, and wounded who are my sacred charge. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for that presentation on flight nurses. It's very thorough. I would like to go back and dig into some of the information that we didn't get as much detail on that I thought was interesting. So, for example, the nurses that crash landed. Can you kind of dig into that a little bit more? I'm not exactly sure what I want to hear, but a little more information.
I can, and it's actually a great story and has a very positive outcome. A group of flight nurses were being transported from one station in Italy to another. And it's like the Gilligan's Island song. They were going on a 2-hour trip, and they encountered bad weather and ended up having to circle an airfield. Eventually, they were unable to land because they didn't know the answer to the challenge at the airfield. So they weren't being given the right aid to land. It was dark and stormy, and they needed the lights to be turned on, landing lights, and they didn't know the answer, so they couldn't land. They did some circling and eventually found a piece of grass that they thought, okay, well, I'm going to take this down. And the pilot instructed everybody to buckle up and be prepared for the crash landing. And everybody except for the crew chief successfully made it into their seats, and they crash landed. The crew chief went flying to the front of the aircraft, actually injuring himself and one of the flight nurses, a couple flight nurses on the way, by kicking them in the face with his big boots. And they landed. They crawl out of this aircraft, and they are met by a group of individuals, one of them riding on this white horse. And they ask where they are, and are we still in Italy? And they were not. They were in Albania, and the Germans were close. And this Albanian group of partisans tried to usher them to safety. They made it to a village where they were encountered by the Germans, and were a little shocked. The Germans were a little shocked to see these female American nurses, and they were told to kind of stay put while they went about other parts of their business. And most of the nurses were actually able to escape. 3 nurses were left behind because of communication issues, but 10 of the nurses, with the help of the Albanian partisans, made it out of the town, and they started their trek to the Italian coast. And they marched across mountains in winter. Just, by the end of the trip, they had no soles on their shoes, and they fought dysentery and other types of diseases, plus the injuries that they sustained in the crash. They were eventually met by the British, and a British officer helped get them to the Italian coast, where they were able to make it on a boat and make it back to their unit. The nurses who were back at their station hospital, or at their station, said that they were told to prepare a lunch and that VIPs were coming. And the nurses just got so excited when the rescued nurses had walked through the door, because they had not heard much about them since they had disappeared. So they were ecstatic to make it back. And eventually, with the assistance of the British, the 3 flight nurses that were left behind in the village were eventually rescued through the same manner.
That is a good
Yeah.
Did they go back?
They were actually not allowed to return back to duty in a flying capacity. I believe the reasoning given was that if captured again or shot down again, they would be treated as spies since the Germans knew their names, and they were sent back to Bowman Field, and many of them went on to be flight nurse instructors.
Wow. Next question. How many patients were evacuated in a single mission?
That varied based on the airframe. A C-47 could be configured to hold 18 litters or 24 ambulatory patients, which is what they called the walking wounded. So they would be in bucket seats. And if it was a C-54, which was a much larger airframe, they could hold the 18 litters and the 24 ambulatory patients.
Okay. Robert says, I'm curious about the loading, unloading of the planes that you referenced. How could one flight nurse and a flight tech load an entire plane with wounded in 10 minutes, let alone 6 minutes?
Well, the flight nurses were trained to do it efficiently. It was part of their training at Bowman Field. They did have the assistance of their enlisted technicians. But one of the other kind of heartwarming parts of this story is that actually one of the pilots and the rest of the crew would get involved too. One of the pilots from Troop Carrier Command in Europe, he said that this was the one job that nobody had to be asked to help with. If they were not on the flight, they would hang around the flight line just to assist. So everybody really cared about doing their part to assist the people who had been on the front lines.
Wow. I would like to know at what point, I mean, all of these flight nurses were women, correct? So at what point did men start becoming flight nurses? Or is that a part of your research?
It is not a part of my research right now, but I do know that I believe flight nursing was still female during the Korean War. I'm not sure about Vietnam, and Vietnam is obviously where it expanded. And I do think that there were male flight nurses. And I actually think that there might have been not an official flight nurse in World War II, but men who flew similar missions that had nursing training in World War II. They just weren't officially called flight nurses.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any more questions, and I don't see any more questions in the chat. So we will move forward. We're going to take a short break, maybe a little bit longer of a break. We'll come right back at the top of the hour for the Scholar Spotlight. So you'll have a little time to stretch, go grab a snack, get a little water, whatever you might need to do right now. But very quickly, I want to say for those of you who will not be joining us for the Scholar Spotlight, thank you for joining us for our World War II Emerging Scholar Symposium. These 4 days have been fantastic and very informative. Our goal for this symposium was to commemorate D-Day by featuring unexplored topics of World War II. And thanks to our scholars, we have been successful. Thank you to each of our scholars for sharing your research with us. Thank you to the Roosevelt and Truman Libraries. And please check the websites of each library for our upcoming programs. So we'll take a short break and we'll see you guys back at 11 o'clock.
Jeff, we have no audio, Jeff. Sorry. Yeah, I think you're on mute.
How's that?
Much better.
Wow. Okay. Sorry. My family's been wanting to do that to me for many, many years. So welcome back. We've had a wonderful presentation by Amanda Hess. Sorry for the little technical glitch there. If you've been watching this week, you have learned so much, and it's been a wonderful opportunity, to learn about these sort of stories off to the side. Now, Amanda, just before we came on, I learned that you are not a PhD student. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but with this kind of research, with this kind of a topic, with this kind of a passion and interest in what you're doing, why not?
Well, after I graduated with my master's degree, I just entered the workforce, and I've been working since then. And history really is my passion, so I have been able to find, work in that area, and that's actually how I came to this topic. So eventually, I would love to go back to school.
Okay. But you're not a nurse, are you?
Pardon?
You're not a nurse.
No, I am not. I have no background in nursing or even in researching nursing before this.
So how did you get into this? I mean, and how did you get so well into it?
Well, this topic was actually given to me by one of my bosses at the Center for Character and Leadership Development at the Air Force Academy. I had told him I wanted to do some writing and some research this year, and that I was, still looking around for some topics. He had just gone to the Air Force Museum and seen an exhibit on flight nursing, and it was a kind of a topic that neither one of us knew anything about. So he suggested it might be something I'd find interesting, and he was right. I was sucked in really quickly. I think that some of the coolest things that I've heard uh, in this project, I mean, there's so many neat things about the women being kind of MacGyvers and getting the job done with whatever tools that were accessible to them. And there's also a really cool female element of it. This whole idea came about really through Loretta Schindler. And while medevac, especially medevac, is a household name, Loretta Schindler is not. And I think while she did get her credit eventually, I think that we need to keep talking about her.
I absolutely agree. Everybody's heard of, Clara Barton. Everybody's heard of Florence Nightingale. But Lieutenant Hawkins, Lieutenant Ott, Schindler. These are just incredible stories of people, not even women, but just people who have put such sacrifice. It was amazing to me to hear that that these women had to sort of pull together their own supplies. I think it was Lieutenant Ott had to put up these guys with her own money on the 11 layovers over the 11,000 miles. These women had some real dedication to their patients. Do you think they were driven by patriotism? Do you think they were driven by, the call for medicine, or do you think they were driven by this need to show that women, had a contribution to make and were able to do it? What do you think was the driving force?
Well, that's an interesting question. The nurses, when they were getting into, of the oral histories that I have been reading and going through, the nurses came to nursing, and most of them actually say that they were kind of meant for it. They were born into it, that it was like what they were supposed to do.
A calling.
Yeah, it was a calling to them. And then when the war came, they were already nurses, and they were working in industrial nursing or private care nursing in hospitals. And when Pearl Harbor happened, almost all of them say, like, that's it, I'm in. And they requested immediately to go join the service. And some of the nurses actually had a background in aviation as well. There's a nurse, Lorena Stroop, who ended up being one of the flight nurse instructors and really instrumental in developing the flight nurse course. And then she got to fly air evacuation missions as well. So her name is Lenora Stroop. She had a background in aviation. She was one of the 99s with Amelia Earhart, as was Loretta Schindler. And Loretta Schindler didn't have a background in nursing. She just had a call that she really wanted to help because she saw from overhead this hurt and this need, and she had the capability with the aircraft to do it, and she wanted to put those things together. The other part of the nurses in World War II, their call beyond the patriotism, I think really was a common thread through a lot of their stories, was a sense of a desire for adventure. They saw flight as an adventurous thing. A lot of them were terrified of it, but it was exciting, and it afforded them an opportunity to travel and to make a career. They had to be unmarried, and so some of them eventually did leave because they got married and they wanted to start those families. But a good handful of the nurses, this was their life, this was their career, and the passion that they had for it continued. And it actually went through, like, even through the Korean War, there were nurses that had served on the first air evacuation missions in Korea as well.
Wow, that's incredible. They were looking for a sense of adventure. So, I know, let's go to a war zone. Let's, fight the bureaucracy. Let's fight the sexism. Let's save men's lives, fly in freezing cold airplanes without supplies and such. My idea of adventure is buying a can without a label and wondering what's in there. Unbelievable stories. Now, we're all familiar, through the television show MASH, of the field hospital, the mobile hospital. So would these wounded folks go there first and then be medevaced out, or how did that work? Where were they? You talked about a 5-layer echelon. Where would that, like, the folks that are familiar with MASH, where would that be in your five levels?
I'm not familiar with MASH, actually, but I think it would be around the third level, that field hospital. I know I need to go back and do some watching, but I think it would be around that third level. So that, I believe, was a kind of a field hospital. And I think it would be very similar. The evacuation chain in World War II was a little flexible as well. So they could be picked up from almost, real close to their injury, especially after D-Day. One of the really impressive women flew in a glider that was towed behind a Waco glider that was towed behind a C-47 and dropped right near the first bridge crossing of the Rhine, and picked up patients directly from there. I mean, they were just pulling them directly, from the field to the glider. And so there was some flexibility to it, but they would tend to pick them up after they had gone through the field hospital.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Yeah. And not only are you a wonderful scholar, but you did a fantastic job of covering for the old fogey in the room that thought you might understand the cultural reference of a television show that went off the air 30 years ago. So my fault on that, but nice job making me look a little less foolish than I made myself. Now, is there like a like, I know at the Vietnam Memorial, there's the 3 guys and they're kind of looking off at the wall with the names, and then they added a nurse statue years later. Is there like a flight nurse memorial statue, plaque, plaza, or anything like that honors these incredible women?
I do not know the answer to that, unfortunately. I hope so. I really hope so, because they deserve all the recognition in the world.
Absolutely. If there's not, there really
should be.
There really ought to be. Yeah. Do they have reunions? Do you know? Do they come back and get together?
They did. I'm not sure if they're still going on. Their numbers are definitely dwindling, but they did, and they put together some great histories, kind of yearbooks of their time in service. And one of the big contributors to my research was Judith Barger, who herself was a flight nurse, but much later she had first come to this this topic because she'd heard of one of the reunions. And so she went to the reunion and she took down a lot of the histories, and she conducted, I think, 26 oral histories. And those have been an invaluable resource. And then she published a book on it. And so she's been fantastic. But a lot of it came out of those reunions.
Where is that material located?
I'm sorry, pardon?
Where is that material located? The oral histories. Where's that housed?
Actually, at the Imperial War Museums, so the British museums. They have that, and they have them online. So if you go to the Imperial War Museum, you can type in flight nurse, and I believe all 26 of her oral histories will pop up. There's also an oral history database on the National Archives that has a great deal of oral histories, and some that I still need to get to when I continue this research. They also collected the medical air evacuation perspective from the flight crews and from the medical technicians, the enlisted men.
Cool. So like when you all right, so your boss comes and says, well, I want you, you go to your boss, I want to do some research and things. He throws you this idea as a topic. You dive in, you take to it like a duck to water. What was the biggest surprise? Or what did you go in with a conception of what you wanted to discover or what you thought you might discover? And how did that differ from what you actually found out once you got in?
I originally had gone in trying to find out more about the leadership qualities of the women. They're there. I know they are. These are women who went into a position of authority as a second lieutenant, nursing officer, but she was in charge. She was in charge of her medical technician, and she had a great deal of sway on the aircraft itself, like on the crew, depending on the medical needs of the patient. I did find that isn't a topic that really has been explored in the oral histories and in other books, and that's something that did surprise me because it seems like an obvious thing to discuss. So I'd like to continue to look into that. The other thing that really surprised me is I couldn't pin down an origin of whose idea flight nurses was very easily, and I really want to get the personal papers of General Grant, because most historians and even the historians who were writing with the approval of the Air Surgeon's office right after the war gave him credit for this. Like this was, something that he felt needed, and he wanted their expertise, and he didn't see the gender in it, and he said, "Let's go." And so I would like to get his personal papers so I can really see his thought process on it.
I bet you that's very interesting, and it's kind of disappointing that you have Ms. Schimler, who's got this idea. She kind of goes back and forth with the Red Cross, and then she connects with Brigadier General or Grant, and once he takes an interest in it, and it's got sort of the male approval, then it begins to to get some ground there. But that would be fascinating to find out more about. Do you think he was just a progressive, forward-looking guy, or do you think he saw the real need for this and the contribution women could make, or do you think it was a combination of both?
I suspect that a lot of the gentlemen and the aviation thinkers of the day were pretty progressive in their thought process. They really were trying to break the mold and do something new. That women were proving themselves in the airfields and in the civilian world. I mean, you had the 99s, which was full of female pilots doing great things. They were showing at air shows, and so there was a presence of them. And I think that they were predisposed to being more progressive in that way. But I would really like to get his personal opinion, on it.
One of the things there was this group of airmen, the Tuskegee Airmen, the African American pilots during World War II, and we had the opportunity to interview some of them maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And one of the things that they really brought forth was they felt that they were just doing a job, but always in the back of their mind, they understood that if they failed at that job, they were not just letting themselves down and not just letting the military down, but also letting down, what people were thinking of in terms of African Americans, right? They thought, well, these guys can't really fly, so they really felt this in the back of their minds always, that they had something to prove, not just for themselves but for the larger population. Do you think these nurses felt that as well? Did they have an eye on, we've got to make this work because we can show women can do these things?
I think they definitely felt like they had something to prove. I'm not sure along what lines, how much of that was based on the gender of them in the aircraft or trying to prove air evacuation. Nursing was still was a predominantly female occupation at the time. So I don't feel like they felt it necessarily that they had to prove nursing or anything like that. But they did have to prove the air evacuation. And I do think there were some of them that felt that they needed to be a good role model for the woman on the aircraft. And there's actually a quote, I forgot who said it. It'll come to me in a second, but he goes, there's going to be some predisposition to discussing your glamour and not actually your contribution. And I do think that is the risk that the flight nurses encountered, and it did happen. There were a lot of people who talked about, the sexy flight nurse and doing her thing, and she was actually shown to be more of a stewardess as less of a medical professional. There was a group of flight nurses who were actually photographed waiting to go to the beaches after Normandy. They were photographed in the poppy fields in France, and that was the cover photo. And that was not their mission. That was them in a holding pattern, and people wanted to take their picture because they were pretty, but they contributed to the war effort in very real ways. And I think that is actually their legacy, even though at the time people were talking a lot about them being females.
Very much like the Tuskegee Airmen, not only did you have to overcome, all the ordinary obstacles of being in the military and learning how to pilot, but you had to overcome that prejudice, that pre-held belief and such. But, glamour, I mean, my goodness, they're packing parachutes, they're, checking deceased soldiers so as not to upset the other soldiers. What an incredible group of women. Now, you mentioned the word role model a minute ago, and I wonder, do you go out and talk to schools or Girl Scout associations or anything like that? Because this is just an incredible story. And again, these women would be role models not just for girls or young women, but for anybody who is interested in contributing and has this calling, as you mentioned a moment ago. So do you speak to groups like that?
I have not, but I do think it's a fantastic idea. This is a bit of a newer project for me. I've only been working on it for a short period of time, and it has really become a passion project for me. So I talk about it ad nauseum, and I would like to take it out to talk to other women and girls.
I think if you've only been in this a short period of time and you're this far into it and you've learned so much and you've shared so much and you've shown so much, I can't wait to see, check back with you in another 8 months or a year and see where you've gone with it from there. But I would definitely urge you to, tell this story. This is an incredible story. And I want to thank you for sharing it with us today and, giving us a lot of things to think about, a lot of information that we've learned, and also, an opportunity to sort of take a look at, what we're doing. I mean, are we contributing the way we should be to our society and things that we're doing? These women saw a need, they came in, they filled it, and that's something that, we can all learn from. So thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing with us. And I can't wait to hear what you do next.
Thank you so much for having me.
Are we going back to Joy now for a final?